countryside. And above all, it's a system that has vitiated our law and filleted our democracy. 4 out of every 5 laws and regulations in Britain now come from Brussels. Right? Come from people not just that we didn't vote for, but people that nobody voted for, by appointed European commissioners. You'll often hear it said that the European Commission is undemocratic in the sense that none of its members is elected. But you know what, my friends, it's worse than that. Uniquely, in Western civilization, the European Union has contrived a system which is in fact anti-democratic in the sense that you generally have to have lost an election before you're appointed to the European Commission. So it's only when you've been expressly rejected by your voters that you are invited to come and rule over them. Well, is it any wonder that a system deliberately invulnerable to public opinion, a system that was designed not to be immune to popular pressures, has led to this expansion of government, this explosion of debt, and, predictably enough, has ended up where we are now. Our treasuries are empty, our credit is exhausted, and the only solution that Brussels has to the debt crisis is to carry on borrowing and carry on spending. It's the American writer Mark Twain who said that if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, right? If you're a government and you spend money, this is what happens. Whatever the crisis, your first instinct is to reach for your wallet. Or rather, your first instinct is to reach for somebody else's wallet, because not a lot of people know this. Bureaucrats are immune from national taxation. It's a fact that they don't bruit about very often, right? So when they talk about paying this price to keep the single currency together, it's of course not they who are going to be paying it. It's going to be a price that is inflicted on the peoples, and we can now see how high that price is. We are inflicting generational poverty and deflation and unemployment and emigration on the Mediterranean countries, and generational tax rises on the northern European countries in order to pay for the transfer payments. All in order to keep the euro together. All rather than admit that the single currency was a mistake. All in order to save face. To pluck an appropriately apt Greek metaphor, these must be the most expensive faces since Helen of Troy's, which launched 1,000 ships. And that's what we joined. Thinking that we were hitching our locomotives to this, we were hitching our wagons to this powerful locomotive, we've in fact shackled ourselves to a corpse. Let me give you a statistic that scared me when I first saw it. The year that we joined the European Union, 1973. Western Europe, which I'll define for these purposes as the 15 member states before we admitted the post-communist countries, Western Europe accounted for 38% of world GDP. Today, that figure is 24%, and in 2020, it will be 15%. Over the same period, Canada's share of the world GDP, and indeed the United States, has remained pretty solid. That is the generational shift in power and in wealth away from Western Europe. We have confined ourselves in a cramped and dwindling customs union, and in so doing, unforgivably, we turned away from the parts of the world where the growth still is, not least this country and the wider community of free English-speaking democracies. Truly, that mistake that my father's generation made was the most calamitous in our recent history. I want to say a word or two about the Anglosphere, about the alliance of free English-speaking peoples. And let me say, je m'adresse à vous comme un admirateur convaincu de la culture française. Personne n'est plus conscient que moi de la contribution des francophones d'Europe et d'Amérique du Nord à la civilisation occidentale. When I talk about the Anglosphere, I am not positing a geographical or an ethnic unit, but rather a community of values. Indeed, one of the great contributions that my country made to the world was the development of the notion of a civic rather than an ethnic conception of nationhood. John Locke in his original compact. Something that makes us very different from a number of neighboring countries in Europe which define nationality in terms of blood and heritage or birth and territory, is that we had this idea that provided you bought into the values, it didn't matter where your parents came from. Go back 100 years and 80% of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. This is not a new phenomenon, but they felt part of the brand. And hundreds of millions of them, twice in the last century, were prepared to cross half the world in order to take up arms for a country on which they'd never set eyes, because they felt part of those values. And that, I think, is something that we've bequeathed to all the other English-speaking democracies. Of course, it took form in the old courthouse in Philadelphia in the US. But it's also the basis of Canadian nationality, of Diefenbaker's One Nation, One Canada. You know, the idea that provided you believe in freedom, in parliamentary supremacy, and in the shared values that we have, it doesn't matter where your grandparents came from. And what are those values? What is it that defines us as Anglosphere peoples? Well, the origin of it is something so sublime and so miraculous that the longer I think about it, the harder I find to explain it. And that's the common law. This extraordinary, providential idea that the law doesn't emanate from the government, but rather the law was already there and the government must be subject to it. That even the king and his ministers are forced to obey the folk right of inherited law that came from somewhere else. Where did it come from? Nobody really knows. We inherited it from our parents, they from theirs, and so on, back to some point lost in the early Anglo-Saxon settlements. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. And once it was there, it defined the relationship between state and citizen. On the basis of a common law system, we understood that the government was there as the servant of the rest of us rather than the other way around. Laws did not emanate from the legislature. It was not above the rest of us. The relationship between government and governed was a different one. And from that basis comes all of the other things which the English-speaking peoples have given to the world. Representative government, control of the executive by the legislature, this extraordinary idea that taxes should not be levied nor laws passed except by our own elected representatives. Property rights enforced by an independent magistracy, free contract, personal freedom, they all go back to that extraordinary idea of common law. And it's made our countries prepared to take up arms where necessary in defense of those values. Not every country has a great story to tell. You look back at the great conflicts of the last century. How many countries were consistently on the right side in the First World War, in the Second World War, in the Cold War? Who consistently got the big calls right? It's a fairly small number. But it includes all of the Anglosphere democracies. You, us, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. And why is that? Well, something made people prepared to take up arms for freedom. And they may not have defined it in terms of some lecture about common law, but they would have understood deep in their marrow that they were defending a system that was free against a system that was tyrannical. You look at the enormous war memorials here in Canada. Ask yourself, were those young men crossing the ocean simply out of some kind of tribalism? Simply because of some coincidence of language? Was it no different from the breakup of Yugoslavia or the Hutus and the Tutsis? Was it simply some kind of ethnic identification with Britain, or wasn't it a belief that we were fighting for a better way of life, a way of life where the citizen was free and where the government couldn't exalt itself over the individual? That's a pretty good story. And it's a story that we shouldn't be ashamed to pass on to our children. They're not just a random set of individuals born to another random set of individuals. They are the inheritors of a sublime tradition. Not far from here, there's a grave which contains the remains of my late uncle. He was training here during the Second World War, and he was a fatality during a training exercise. It's not a very glamorous way to end. They don't make films about it, but it was a very common fate for a lot of people, a lot of participants in that conflict. More people were killed in training in the preparation for D-Day than were killed in enemy action after the landings. Of course, this was a long way from home. And a couple of years after the funeral, which my late grandfather couldn't make, he got a letter from a Canadian woman. She'd inferred from the inscription on the grave that the family was distant, and she'd sent a photograph. She said, "I'll look after it." We never met her. My aunt lives in New Zealand, in Auckland. This is her 90th year. 2 years ago, she got a round-the-world ticket, and for the first time she was able to come and pay her respects at her brother's grave here in Canada. It's a small Anglosphere story. It's not nearly as dramatic and exciting as some. But it reminds us of what it was that we were fighting for and what it was that we have in common and what we still could have in common as free people living under our own laws and our own parliaments. Our fathers, yours and mine, were prepared to defend with force of arms our independence, our liberty. It doesn't matter where our ancestors came from. We are all joint inheritors of that sublime patrimony. It's our privilege and it's our task to cling fast to that heritage and to pass it on intact to our children.